Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. I hope you had a great weekend. Of course, we started the NFL season, so those of you that, especially in the Dallas area, probably feel pretty good about that win. And we're going to move on to many other topics, but I just thought I'd give you kind of a preview of what's going to happen over the next couple of hours. In about a half an hour, we're going to be chatting with our good friend, Representative Matt Krause. You may remember him as an individual that not only is a lawyer, but also is an individual that has been a youth pastor and has really been very concerned about religious liberty. And so his bill, which later came to be known as the Chick-fil-A bill, although at the time he introduced it, it had nothing to do with Chick-fil-A, but the Chick-fil-A phenomenon and debacle there in the San Antonio airport forced that bill into some prominence, which then was killed in the House and later resurrected from the Senate. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I got a funny feeling he's going to want to maybe also address the issue of guns, if for no other reason than another Matt Schaefer has been saying some things about that it created an incredible Twitter storm. So we'll get into some of that conversation with Matt Krause in about a half an hour. I might also mention that at the 1 o'clock hour, we have Louis Markos with us. He is the author of this article that appeared in Christianity Today, The Rise of the Bible-Teaching, Plato-Loving Homeschool Elitist. It's kind of a turn of phrase, to put it mildly. But nevertheless, we're going to be talking about classical Christian education, what's happening in the homeschools, what's happening in Christian schools, and why you need to know more about that. This article has gotten quite a bit of press. As a matter of fact, last night I was just noticing that Doug Groteis, who's been on the program with us before, actually featured it in his Facebook page as one of the very good articles that he appreciated. So I just couldn't resist and put in there, well, it turns out that we're going to have Louis Markos on the program on Monday, and then he came back and liked it and appreciated that as well. So that's another one of those topics we're going to get into. And in the third hour, I've got quite a bit of free time, so this is going to be an opportunity to kind of give you a preview of what is going to happen this Thursday with the Democratic Convention. But I decided to focus a little bit of time on, have the Democratic parties and the Democratic candidates, have they made their peace with religion? Because on the one hand, as you'll see in one of the articles we've posted by our good friend in the Washington Post, that Robert Knight points out that they seem to be at the same time saying we really want to reach out to the religiously unaffiliated. So we're going to talk more and more about secular values. At the very same time, when you have Mayor Pete as well as a number of other candidates using, and I think I can make the case, misusing religion to argue for some of their policy pronouncements. So we'll see where that takes them, and that will be one of the conversations that we will have in the third hour. Also, I want to spend some time as well in that third hour talking about immigration. The very interesting article I've posted here by Politico points out that the number of people at the border has dropped precipitously in terms of the number of arrests. Now, I recognize that this is not the perfect metric. Just because the number of people arrested goes down doesn't necessarily mean the number of the people trying to cross the border have gone down. You could be having a month in which you missed people, but there's enough evidence now to suggest that this is happening in large part because President Trump, you might remember him, spent some time actually threatening a tariff against Mexico if they don't start actually enforcing what's supposed to take place. When you come from another country, El Salvador, Guatemala, wherever, into Mexico and you ask for asylum, you ask for it there. You don't travel all the way through the state and the country of Mexico before you then ask for asylum at the U.S. border. So because they're doing that, because interdictions are taking place at that border, the number of people crossing the border seems to be going down, number one. Number two, I also want to take on the issue of whether or not we're building that much of the wall. And there's a very good analysis, which even today was interesting. Fox News picked up on that, saying, the president really has not kept that campaign promise. So we really want to be fair about looking at what has or has not happened at the wall. And so those are some immigration issues as well. But just before we take a break, I thought I would talk about the issue of debt, since we talked about it on Friday. And the reason for that is, first of all, we still have our article from Outlook. If you would like to get that, it's free of charge from Outlook. But more importantly, there was an article that came out today in the Wall Street Journal that said debt shouldn't stop you from driving. And so the writer points out that there are some good reasons to suspend licenses, such as driving infractions. But research suggests that as of 2006, nearly 40% of license suspensions stem from unrelated missteps, and it remains a common practice today. Unpaid parking tickets, court cost, child support, minor drug offenses, like the first-time possession of a controlled substance, or even unpaid student loans. And she points out that revoking the license of a person who can't pay off fines or loans exacerbates the underlying problem. Myriad professions, including taxi drivers, cable installers, caregivers, construction workers, HVAC technicians, landscape crews, maintenance workers, and plumbers, require the ability to drive. If a plumber loses his driver's license, so goes his job and his ability to make good on any money he owes. And I was reading this, it reminded me of one of those archaic laws that existed centuries ago, the so-called debtor's prisons. And that made no sense. Here's a person that has to pay a debt, so let's throw them in prison where they have virtually no opportunity to pay off that debt. Does that make any sense? And that's kind of where we are right now. Then she goes on to point out one other point, and that's all I'll really focus on, is that license suspensions hurt one group more than any other: minority communities. In one low-income neighborhood in Milwaukee, for example, she points out, 2 of every 3 working-age African Americans do not have a license, according to the Employment Training Institute of the University of Wisconsin. And another study found that 95% of California zip codes where African Americans made up more than a fifth of the population had license suspension rates above the state average. So the point she is making, and it's a really good one, is if indeed a person owns a debt, it doesn't make a great deal of sense then to withdraw from them the one particular opportunity they might have to pay back that debt, and that is to drive a car or a truck. So I thought it was a good point, and it's just one other aspect of the conversation we had just the other day. We talked about debt on Friday in the first hour. If you'd like to hear that again, it's available on our website, pointofview.net. The previous day on Thursday at the 3 o'clock hour also played it as well, because I thought it was very appropriate to address this issue of debt, and it's certainly one of the booklets we make available. And this time next week, I might just mention that we're going to start our Truth Team, and you, as you join with us, if you join us even for $1 a day, $30 a month, you can receive the Outlook magazine. But the Outlook articles on debt is available still on our website at pointofview.net. And if you join at a higher level, you'll receive those booklets in the mail. And so I just hope that even as we're a week away from encouraging you to support this ministry, that when we talked about the subject of debt, I wanted to give you some more thoughts about that. And perhaps one of the things we need to rethink in terms of our criminal justice law is whether or not it makes sense to revoke a license from a person who's trying to pay back the debt. Common sense sometimes eludes some of our politicians. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Some court cases can be complex and convoluted. This isn't one of them. The Kentucky Supreme Court heard oral arguments for the case of Blaine Adamson. He is the print shop owner who declined to print shirts with a message promoting the Gay Pride Festival, but offered to connect the local group to another printer. Before you jump to the conclusion that his decision is merely another religious liberty versus LGBTQ issues, consider other shirts he declined to print or decided to print. For example, he declined to print a picture of Jesus on a bucket of chicken, even though it was requested by a local church. On the other hand, he has printed materials for a lesbian singer who has performed at a Pride festival. He has so far won at the trial court and court of appeals. I hope the judges at the Kentucky Supreme Court agree with the other judges in this case that artists have the right, even the responsibility, to use their artistic talents that are in keeping with their viewpoint. Someone else who understands the importance of this case is Kathy Trutvetter. She runs her own print shop in New Jersey. She's also a lesbian. Though she may agree with the LGBTQ message, she emphatically disagrees with forcing people to print a message against their conscience. She also believes we have the constitutional right to free speech. She doesn't want to be put in a position of having to print a message on her shirts that she does not like. I wish more people on either side of our cultural divide would think through the implications of forcing a person to create a message that violates their conscience. If government can force Blaine to violate his beliefs, it can force you to violate yours. It is bad enough when a government agency silences your speech. It's even worse when that government agency compels speech. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, let me, for just a few minutes, talk about a story. It's kind of a local story that has national implications. And since so many of you are in the Dallas area and hear this broadcast, it is appropriate. But even for our listeners up there in Minnesota, we certainly want to acknowledge you. And I think today we actually picked up our station in Chicago. So I do want to acknowledge that not everybody is in the state of Texas, but this is a classic illustration of a story that, first of all, has local implications. Then as you begin to watch it, has national implications because of something that actually ends up in the fourth to the last paragraph. I will give high praise to Mike Gallagher for pointing this out. Actually, it was his researcher that caught this, because this is actually a story that's been out for a while, but it's an ongoing story, and it has to do with a man who is now being identified as a serial killer in the Dallas area. The story, which appeared in the Washington Post, talks about Phyllis Payne, and her family thought that she had died of natural causes. After all, she was 91 years of age. She was in a retirement community in Dallas. And when they first discovered her, that she had deceased, she looked like she died in her sleep. Years later, though, as this article points out, an unexpected call from a police detective would change everything. And it turns out that what they have found is that this is an individual who is 46 years of age, who is accused not only of killing her, but at least a dozen other women. And as I'll point out as we get further into this article, they are checking now hundreds of other sort of unsolved murders, or ones that were just assumed to be died of natural causes, and wonder if indeed the 12 that they've identified so far are just the tip of the iceberg. But again, they have now argued that this individual smothered his victims with pillows before making off with their jewelry or other valuables. Now, because these women were elderly and lived alone, their deaths were not considered suspicious, and initially those were not actually investigated. But now there are people that are investigating this a lot more. And so the officials, according to this article, began to reevaluate the deaths of these hundreds of elderly women in the Dallas-Fort Worth area because they might have been overlooking a pattern of homicides. And the investigation began, interestingly enough, after another woman, also 91 years of age, was robbed in her Plano, Texas apartment. What happened is this woman opened the door, and this man forced his way in, told her to lie down on the bed, not fight him. When she obeyed his commands, he placed a pillow over her face to smother her. She lost consciousness, and interestingly enough, she did not die, but instead a friend happened to stop by, called the paramedics, revived her, and at the time, after she regained her consciousness, of course, the assailant was long gone, but so was her jewelry box. And all of a sudden, the pattern started to click. And so they began to investigate. And so as a result, they had someone who had reported a suspicious vehicle, the license plate linked back to this individual. And so when they went and staked out his home, they saw him tossing a jewelry box into the trash. And of course, there's a whole series of other things in terms of lipstick smeared and just a variety of other things. And I'm sure they've also done all sorts of other samples. But it's now becoming obvious that this man is a serial killer. And if these hundreds check out, of course, we don't know any more than the dozen. And the police have not talked about all the ways in which they've traced him to at least these 12 murders. But if indeed these numbers go up, I mean, he's in the pantheon, sad to say, with Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy and Richard Ramirez and stuff like that. And so as a result, we're starting to see that is the case. And it also began to collect with someone else because there was a 93-year-old woman. This goes back a year ago. Actually, it goes back 2 years ago. I take that back. And this was a woman in Frisco in which he knocked on the door, identified himself as a maintenance individual, picked up a pillow, tried to smother her as well. And this particular case, the woman couldn't, she was somehow able to escape, but she couldn't remember enough of the details to identify him. But now that they had him in custody, they went back and checked out that his cell phone connected to a cell tower within about a half a mile of the woman's apartment. And so anyway, I'm telling you this long, detailed story about an individual that indeed is perhaps one of these people that may be in that long, sad list of individuals that indeed were serial killers. And then you get to nearly the last, it's actually about the fourth to the last paragraph, in which in the Washington Post it says this: a citizen of Kenya, I won't say his name, lived in the greater Dallas area for more than a decade and had a history of DWI assault charges, according to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. 2016, he was charged with trespassing in a retirement community in Dallas, where one of his alleged victims reportedly lived. And he's being held on bail because he is in the country illegally. Federal immigration authorities have additionally placed a jail hold on him. Now, this is something that I had missed before, and it's easy to miss because you have to read through the entire story almost before you get to one of the points about that he is here illegally. And it illustrates one of the points we've made before. You don't want to say that everybody here is a murderer or a rapist or they're here for terrorist activities. But you also don't want to say the other extreme of saying that everybody's here simply because they want to experience the American dream and they want to provide for themselves and their families. The argument that has always been made about this president is when he even announced he was running for office 4 years ago, more than 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago, he was actually talking about the fact that sometimes those countries don't send their best to this country. And here is a classic illustration of an individual that has been here illegally And you have to have a question mark in your mind, if nothing else, what would have happened if indeed he was prosecuted and he was deported, whether or not some of those individuals who lost their lives would still be alive to this day. So, story just thought I'd bring to you, and it's one of those ones where even the Washington Post eventually mentions he's here illegally, but it's not exactly the lead part of the story, and one of the reasons why you have to read articles all the way to their end and have a little bit of discernment along the way. One other point about media bias, and this one came out from our friends at the Guidestone Institute. They pointed out that in the very same week as you had the attack in Christchurch in New Zealand, you also had more than 200 Christians who were killed in Nigeria at a time when you've had, satellites observing the Amazon fires. You also have a situation in which there were attacks on Christians who were murdered, but that wasn't, of course, tracked by satellites. And at a time when even some of these so-called church leaders of different denominations are speaking out against global warming and about climate change, you don't have them talking now about what has been happening here. And this article, I won't go into it because it is brutal what especially Boko Haram has been doing, first of all, to the women that are allowed to live by cutting off their ears, and I won't go any further than that, but then just horrifically of what in some cases in Burkina Faso and others that have been murdered because they were wearing crosses. And, of course, we've spent a fair amount of time on this program over the years talking with our friend David Curry, who's the president of Open Doors, talking about just the incredible persecution of Christians in Africa. And this is a horrific story, but it also is a story. And it's just a good example, again, of the tremendous amount of attention that has been placed on some of the kinds of shootings that have taken place in New Zealand or in the United States, and some of the very real concerns about the loss of life because of shooters who oftentimes have very evil motives. But at the very same time when that is taking place, virtually no media coverage at all about some of the incredible persecution that has taken place. And again, just to use one illustration, at the very same time in which there was the attack in the mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, more than 200 Christians were killed in Nigeria, and yet hardly a mention in the news. So one of the reasons why we continue to cover this through groups like Open Doors and Voice of the Martyrs is to recognize that sometimes the mainstream media just never believes that these are stories worth even mentioning. Obviously not on front page, maybe not even on page 2 or 3, but oftentimes never mentioned at all. And I thought I'd bring that up today just to focus on one other reason why it's important to pay attention to some of the things we try to post on our website here at Point of View. Let's take a break. We're going to spend some time talking with Representative Matt Krause right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us for a little while Representative Matt Krause, born in Tyler, Texas, where his father was youth pastor at Green Acres Baptist Church, a constitutional attorney, college professor, and, of course, an individual that is now in his third term at the Texas State Legislature. Matt Krause, always great to have you on the program with us.
I always appreciate you having me on. Always good talking with you, Kerby.
You are all over social media. First, I see a picture of you and your wife at the Dallas Cowboys game. That was a pretty good game to watch. And then this morning, I see you having fun with our friends at Babylon Bee. We've had a couple of people that have actually been with Babylon Bee on the program where it says, Antifa mob torches local kids' lemonade stand. And you're saying, well, maybe we're going to have some protection there. By the way, this is a joke. Babylon Bee is not to be taken seriously, though our friends at Snops.com tend to take them a little more seriously than I think they should. But if nothing else, Matt, I appreciate the fact that anytime people want to know what you're thinking, you have taken some time, oftentimes, to address issues, whether it's the Speaker of the House, the pro-life issues, gun issues, or a variety of other things. And I really appreciate that about you and the integrity that you bring to the office. So, again, thank you for all that you do for us.
Well, thank you. And you know, it's funny. Every time I post something from the Babylon Bee, I get a lot of frustrated people either not realizing it's satire or seemingly not able to have a sense of humor in this day and age. So it's kind of interesting to see those reactions when you post that stuff, but I think it's more of a
just take it. Can't you take a joke? Anyway, let's get into, first of all, I want to look in the back and then in the front. So we'll look at the rearview mirror for just a minute. And you, of course, were the sponsor, I think it was of HB 3172. That came to be known later as the Chick-fil-A bill. It did not make it through the House, but then another bill from the Senate did. And I think that's something to talk about for just a minute, because if there's one thing that certainly we identify with Matt Krause, it is the fact that you have kept your eye on this issue of religious liberty. And even before the flap of Chick-fil-A at San Antonio Airport, you were saying, you know, we've got to be concerned about the fact that if you start discriminating against someone because they have some kind of affiliation or because they've donated, in this case, to the Salvation Army and the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, we just need to prohibit that kind of discrimination from taking place. And so even though your bill didn't finally make it to the goal line, another very similar bill did, and I know that you are excited about what that means for the future, not just for a Chick-fil-A, but for a lot of small businesses and other individuals, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think a lot of folks thought we filed the bill in response to what happened with San Antonio and Chick-fil-A. But this is actually a bill we had filed the previous session and again this session, because we want to continue to say that it's important for Texas to affirm and to strengthen religious liberty protections. Because I think, as you've talked about so many times on the show, if you don't get religious liberty right, you get a lot of other things wrong in the culture. And so, but once the Chick-fil-A situation happened, it really crystallized and clarified why you continue to need these protections, why you continue to need this kind of legislation. And so, yeah, mine fell a little bit short, but thankfully we had Brian Hughes over in the Senate, who's just an unbelievable senator, thinking they're right along with us. He picked up the slack and got it out of the Senate over to the House, and we were able to get it to the governor's desk.
Let's just for another minute talk about that, and then I want to get into pro-life issues and a variety of others. But one of the points that I've made is people don't understand how this already takes place. You have an individual in California that lost his job effectively because he supported an amendment to the California Constitution that defined marriage between one man and one woman. On Friday, Jeremy Dice and I are talking about the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passing a resolution that, first of all, declared the National Rifle Association a domestic terrorist organization, but moreover, actually told the individuals in the city to take every reasonable step to limit any kind of business interaction with the NRA, which means if you maybe even donated to the NRA, you might lose a contract with that business. And then we're trying to urge other cities to follow that example. So for people that say you're trying with the HB 3172 or the so-called Chick-fil-A bill to solve a problem that doesn't exist, they haven't been paying attention to the media and to the news, have they?
Oh, that's exactly right. And we're seeing it over and over and over. And a lot of people think, well, that is in San Francisco or that is in New England. But no, it was right here in Texas that we were having those issues. And we're seeing that more and more, that the government is not only not agreeing with somebody's message, but using the force of government to actually penalize them when they feel like that they're wrong. And I think that's very dangerous on both sides. I don't want a government that I agree with, doing that to somebody who disagrees with me. That's not the role of government, and can lead to disastrous consequences.
Representative Matt Krause with us, and we're talking about a couple of things that have already occurred in the legislature, and then we'll look at some that may occur if there's a special session. But again, if you know Matt Krause, you know that religious liberty is a key issue. Pro-life issues are important. We've had Candy Noble in here talking about one of those issues, but and also we've had Jeff Leach on just recently on the Millennial Roundtable. So these are some things we've mentioned, but come back to those, because there were at least 3 significant pro-life bills that came out of the legislature, and every one of those had a very significant impact on the culture, didn't they?
Yeah, that's right. And for Representative Noble, she was in her first term, but she did an amazing job carrying a heady bill, which basically said that we're not going to give any kind of sweetheart deals or contracts from local governments to abortion providers. You had down in Austin, they were basically allowing Planned Parenthood to use their facilities for, I think it was $1 a year a lease. And that's basically using taxpayer-funded taxpayer dollars to fund the activities that went on inside that Planned Parenthood. And so we just thought we shouldn't be using any taxpayer money to carry on this practice. And so Representative Noble's bill just makes sure that you can't have any of these kind of deals, these contracts, with local governments and abortion providers. And then Representative Leach had a great bill, the Infant Born Alive Protection Act. And coming into session, if you remember, in New York and Virginia and other places, you started having all these conversations of, when is a human? And the governor of Virginia basically said, maybe you deliver the child and then see if the mother wants that child and then make a decision. Well, that's infanticide. And so Representative Leach had the bill to say, if an abortion is attempted and the child somehow survives, which does happen, we had a couple of those ladies come and testify in front of our committee. If you survive the abortion, then the doctor is under an obligation to provide life-saving treatment to that child and make sure that child gets the treatment that he or she needs. And so a lot of people said it hardly ever happens. It's just kind of a statement bill. Well, even if you do call it a statement bill, the fact that no Democrats, or hardly any Democrats, could vote in support of it shows how extreme that party is on this issue, that they can't even support giving life-saving treatment to a child who survived an abortion. And then one other thing that we did during session was substantially increase the amount of funding for alternatives to abortion, which is the program in Texas where crisis pregnancy centers and other places get funds from the state to provide counseling services, pregnancy services, postpartum, prenatal care for these women going through pregnancy, to make sure that they can have the child and promote the sanctity of human life.
Just before we take a break, and I want to come back and talk about maybe what could happen in the future, because, of course, the issue of guns and a variety of other things are on the table. One of the other pieces that I wanted to alert our listeners to is they will have an opportunity to vote on whether or not to have an income tax in the state of Texas, and that is to actually prohibit an income tax, which has always been kind of lurking in the background. And I think this is just another opportunity to let the voters express their will. And this is something that I know you've tried in the past to actually put on the ballot. Now it looks like it'll be there for us to vote on.
That's right. And again, another congratulations to Representative Leach, who spearheaded that effort this legislative session. But yes, if you want to make sure that a income tax is pretty much prohibited and banned for all eternity, vote yes on that proposition this coming November. But we're going to put it in the Constitution. That way it's not just subject to the votes of the House and the Senate and the signature of the governor. It has to go back to the people should you ever want to institute a income tax, and I think that is very powerful.
And as we get closer, I'll explain that you vote yes to vote no. But again, that's always one of those things that's kind of interesting. When we come back from the break, I want to address the issue of guns. You know, you're familiar with Matt Schaefer, I guess. And if you want to start a firestorm on Twitter, just simply say that having a gun is a God-given right. And he found that out the hard way. But of course, we also have a lieutenant governor that is saying maybe it's time to have more complete background checks. And if indeed the governor of the state of Texas decides to call a special session, love to know some of your thoughts about that. And to kind of look ahead to other issues, some of the unfinished issues of the last legislative session, because there were a few. And so we are privileged to have with us for just a few more minutes Matt Krause, who is a representative representing our good friends in the District 93. And if you, by chance, have a question, feel free to give us a call. But when we come back, I've got some more questions for him. And I think it is important to not only look back on what has happened in the legislature, but look ahead what might happen in the future. We'll do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Representative Matt Krause with us for a few more minutes, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Of course, this issue of gun control surfacing once again because of two different shootings in the state of Texas, actually more than that, but two more recent ones. And Matt Schaefer the other day just simply said, we won't use the evil acts of a handful of people to diminish the God-given rights of my fellow Texans. And, of course, that created an enormous Twitter storm. But more to the point, you have now the lieutenant governor saying maybe we have a loophole here at the stranger to stranger passing of one gun to the other should have a background check. The governor at this point has resisted the idea of having any kind of special session, but maybe you have a little better understanding of whether or not that might take place, and more importantly, what could, if anything, be done to address this issue of the shootings that have taken place in the state of Texas.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything different necessarily from the governor or his office in the last couple of days that would suggest that he's changed his mind on calling a special session. I've always worked well with Lieutenant Governor Patrick. I think he's always been a very staunch supporter of the Second Amendment. So anytime he has a proposal or a thought, I want to hear him out. I want to talk with him. I do know there's a lot of people who feel the way I do in the legislature, that we swore an oath to protect and uphold the Constitution. And anything that we would do would have to make sure that we were being truthful and having a fidelity to that. So I don't know if I'd have to see the language, and I'd have to see what the lieutenant governor is actually proposing. But if it violated the constitutional principles, then that would be tough for me to get there.
Yeah, I would think so. And again, I'm not sure that there will be a special session, although I think it will be used by the Democrats as a way to kind of argue for that and to maybe even use it as a campaign issue. And if you're a senator, we've had Angela Paxson here. You don't have to run this time, but you do. And so some of the conversations that you are going to have with the voters and others are going to certainly surface on that. So it's going to be one of those topics that I think is going to be around for some time. It's going to be used, I suspect, by anybody that chooses to run against you as an opponent. So we'll kind of pay attention to those issues. But the broader issue is something that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the program, and that is right now the Democrat Party is having difficulty. We're going to talk about this on our national hour, between whether or not they want to replace worship with God of the worship of the state, because you have a more recent adoption of trying to reach out to the religiously unaffiliated. And there are a lot of people that certainly are not Christians or not religious who are in the voting bank. But then you have others that, like Mayor Pete and others, that are actually using Christianity, I would say, on my own perspective, in an illegitimate way. So religion is something that either is going to be a big issue in the campaign or either for or against, and it's just, again, an illustration of maybe coming back and thinking about some of these foundational principles. And as somebody that oftentimes speaks for groups like Wall Builders and others, you're well aware of the fact that John Adams reminded us that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have your rights as a non-Christian, but it does mean that those idea of rights and responsibilities, we believe, according to the Declaration of Independence, are God-given and they're endowed by our Creator. What would you say to some people that have never really thought about that issue? Because you certainly lecture on that on a pretty regular basis.
That's right. And I would say that because there's a lot of non-religious conservatives that I'll run into from time to time, and who don't necessarily believe what we believe from a faith perspective, but want to have as limited a government as possible, the government to stay out of their lives as much as possible. And I always try to point them back to the Founding Fathers. Like you said, they understood that if you don't have something that internally polices yourself, government's going to have to continue to grow and expand to fill that role. And our Founding Fathers understood about the best policing mechanism that you can have is to follow a religion that says to be good, to be kind, to love all, to not harm your neighbor, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so I think that's why they focused in on religion and morality, especially Christianity, was to have people understand, hey, you can either do it yourselves internally with your internal compass and conscience, or we can do it externally. And since we're a nation founded on limited government and keep the government out of my life as much as possible, people still want that, but forget the first part of the equation. And when you eschew that out of the way, then you can't have that second part like they want.
Well, and again, one of the things I hear from some of my secular friends is, well, look, I can be good without God. And I say, well, I don't deny that. I mean, some of the nicest people I've ever met are atheists. Okay, so that's not the point. But the point is you don't have any kind of moral basis for it, as we'll be talking about a little bit later when we talk about Robert Knight's article, which I posted here today, is if you're looking for a moral foundation apart from Christianity for things like the sanctity of human life, individual rights, the idea of free markets, private property, self-government, you're going to have trouble finding those in any other document other than in documents which either were Christian or influenced by Christian ideas. And so as somebody that studied kind of religious liberty and has a law degree, you recognize that this concept of our rights being rooted in God and the idea that Christianity really led to the rise of what today we consider the republic that we live in, modern democracies, those don't come out of a secular atheistic point of view. They come out of a Judeo-Christian view, don't they?
That's exactly right. It's out of the understanding that government doesn't grant rights and create rights. God does. And if you don't have anything above the government that you have right now, then they get to dictate exactly the morals, the ethics. I mean, it's not too far extreme. You take it to its logical conclusion. It's the Nazism of the 1930s and 40s, where Hitler was able to say to a whole group of people, you don't belong to exist. We can do things to you that it doesn't matter. When there's nothing above that government to keep them in check, that's where things lead. And so what we've had since the 1776 is the recognition that government can't just do what they want to. They're subjected to a higher power. They've got to recognize and protect the rights that are God-given, not man-given. And when you have that perspective, things are completely different.
I might just mention, just before I let you go, that we have a link to mattkrause.org. Krause is spelled with a K, but you don't have to worry about that because we have a link there as well. And for listeners that find themselves maybe in your district, District 93, I know you'd love to hear from them, but also know enough about you that if somebody else wants to ask you a question or make a comment or give you a suggestion for a piece of legislation, even if they aren't in your district, you would certainly welcome their input. And there's a place there where they can follow you, and we have links so they can follow you on Twitter and on Facebook. And of course I do, and certainly appreciate some of the posts that you've put there where they can join with you in your campaign, where they can get your newsletter and all sorts of other things. But talk about what's available in case anybody wants to go to mattkrause.org. What will they find?
Yeah, you'll find a little bit more about me as a person. I'm married way up to my wife, Jenny. We have 5 kids. You'll read a little bit more about that in my background there. You'll see my positions on issues such as pro-life issues, Second Amendment, government spending, immigration, kind of get to know a little bit more where I stand there. There's always a donate button, too, if people want to try that out. But it just gives you a little bit of a better understanding of who I am, what I stand for, and what I seek to do down in Austin, which is to increase liberty as much as possible and to make sure the government is operating as efficiently and effectively and as most limited as it can and doing the job it's supposed to do. You
got to see them on Facebook. Just the cutest family, Jenny and Jeremiah, Hannah, Sue, James, Gracie, and Ruthie. And they are quite photogenic, and they show up every once in a while on some of those posts. So, Matt Krause, always a delight to have you on the program. We can't wait till the next time you bring you and your family into the studio, and have a great day.
Yes, sir. Great talking with you. Keep up the good work.
We will come back, and we're going to be talking with Louis Markos, the rise of Bible-teaching, Plato-loving homeschool elitist. I think you're going to really enjoy that conversation about classical Christian education. That coming up right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. I hope you had a great weekend, and we're going to have quite a busy week as we spend a fair amount of time talking with a number of different guests, both in studio and some by phone. And in just a few minutes, we're going to be talking about this idea of classical Christian education, what's happening in the homeschool market, what's happening in the Christian market. And then we're going to get into, as we look ahead to the Democratic presidential debate that will be taking place later this week. You know, Democrats have kind of an uneasy relationship between religion. Some want to reach out, as we have seen more recently, to actually reach out to the religiously unaffiliated, according to a latest resolution that came from the Democratic National Committee. But at the same time, we've had a number of individuals, Mayor Pete and others, talking about religion and what he believes God would allow or not allow, what the Bible teaches and does not teach. So we're going to get into some of that a little bit later. And then we're also going to look at this issue of immigration. Politico says that really some of the plans that President Donald Trump have implemented in terms of immigration seem to be getting some results in terms of the number of individuals that have actually been arrested at the border has dropped precipitously. We'll talk about why that is taking place, but at the same time also do a fact check. Indeed, has the border wall really been built? How much is this actually a campaign policy, a promise that has not been fulfilled? And so we're going to get into all sorts of very important topics just today alone. I might just mention Dennis Prager is going to be in studio with us actually tomorrow, which I will tape and air perhaps on Wednesday. And so we'll get into all sorts of very important issues all through the week. But I wanted to spend just a little bit of time, if we could, talking about this very excellent article that appeared in Christianity Today with the provocative title, The Rise of the Bible-Teaching, Plato-Loving Homeschool Elitist. And not only did I think it was a very good article, but as I was looking last night on the Facebook page for Doug Groteis, who's been on the program with us a couple of times, more recently even to talk about Francis Schaeffer, he endorsed the article. So then I said, well, interestingly enough, I've got Louis Markos on the program on Monday. And so that generated some response as well. So there are a number of people talking about this article. And so I thought it would be very good for you to hear from Dr. Louis Markos, has his bachelor's degree in English and history from Colgate University, a master's and PhD in English from the University of Michigan. If you're not familiar with him, of course, he is professor of English and also a scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University, holds the chair of humanities. You may be familiar with some of his books. On the Shoulders of Hobbits, maybe the one that is probably passed by and one that you've seen before, or his book Apologetics in the 21st Century, From Achilles to Christ, Why Christians Should Read the Pagan Classics, and many others that I could mention. 18 different books he's posted, and we also have posted this article that came out just recently in the September issue of Christianity Today. Dr. Louis Markos, just a delight to have you on the program with us today.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Let's, if we can, start with where you start out, and that is you were speaking to a homeschool co-op, and you were actually wondering whether or not, as you talk about Latin and Western civilization and Plato and things like that, whether or not you would have a ready acceptance, and to your surprise, or maybe your delight, whatever it might be, you found that parents, students, and teachers had a shared vision for this idea of studying the great books of the world. Tell us more.
Well, I'll tell you, Kerby, when homeschooling started, whatever the new homeschooling movement, say 40 years ago, a lot of the evangelical homeschoolers were sort of Bible-only people, right? We're not reading the pagan classics. Well, what can we possibly learn from a pre-Christian pagan, someone who's unregenerate? Well, why am I going to expose my kids to that? Everything we need to know is in the Bible. Well, that may have been the beginning, but homeschooling has morphed. It's changed quite a bit over the last 20 years. And what I'm finding, to my delight, as you said, is that the homeschoolers are not only saying, all right, grudgingly, it's okay if we read Homer or Virgil or Plato, Aristotle, Cicero. No, they're saying we need to read this stuff. We need to learn from it. God can give us true wisdom, right? Because all truth is God's truth. Now, of course, we can be bold in this, Kerby, because we have a measure, a touchstone, a yardstick. We have the Bible. So we have something to judge this wisdom. We're not going to just be undiscerning and say, okay, it's a great book, we believe everything. No, we can test it against Christ and the Bible, particularly the New Testament, and we can find whether it's true. But there's been a real sea change, a shift to saying, no, this is part of our heritage, our Judeo-Christian Greco-Roman heritage. It's also part of our heritage as Americans. So, I love how your program is bringing together apologetics and things like the founding of our country and realizing that our founding fathers looked at the Bible, but they also looked at the Greco-Romans, and that this is who we are as people in the West, a serendipitous crossing of the Judeo-Christian stream that comes out of Jerusalem and the Greco-Roman stream that comes out of Athens, and that those two can and should come together. And it is exciting, and it's not insular anymore. It's not let's pull out of the world. It's let's engage. And Kerby, this is happening at the very moment that the so-called Ivy League schools in our country have thrown out the classics and thrown out the great books. So God has a sense of humor. The pagan classics are going to be saved by the least likely people, evangelical Christians. It's wonderful.
Good. And again, my own alma mater, they actually received a grant from the Bass brothers to teach Western civilization, and the university handed the money back again because they didn't want to do so. And you even quote the protesters at Stanford, hey, ho, Western civilization or Western culture's got to go.
Yep.
And it's almost impossible, Dr. Markos, now to go to a major university and actually get a class in Western civilization, isn't it?
You really can't. You'll be lucky if you read a couple Shakespeare plays, but they'll be taken from a very politically correct and postmodern viewpoint. But it's gone. And the amazing thing about it is that the only reason these people have a platform from which they can attack everything is because they live in a culture that was built on Athens and Jerusalem. See, that's the irony of all of this. The free speech that they cherish and use to beat us on the head, they only have that because they're in a culture that's been formed by these great books, filtered through Christianity. So it's a terrible irony, and I think it's catching up with them. And I tell you, I'm glad when I speak to homeschoolers in the classical Christian schools. I tell them, I said, homeschoolers devote so much time, so much money. You send them to classical, all of this stuff to shape them. And then too often, for a little bit of vanity, we send our kids to a school that will do everything they can to destroy everything we taught them.
Yeah.
And I think that finally Christians are wising up. We got plenty of fine Christian schools. I teach at Houston Baptist. We've got Baylor. We've got we've got Grove City. There's so many. We've got Wheaton. We've got so many good schools out there. And it's time that we started saying, hey, why are we going to send our children to a place that is actually hostile to everything that we believe? And I think changes are coming.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about a few people. Dorothy Sayers, and I remember years ago, I've been teaching and actually host of this program for, 33 years. I remember the first time I interviewed a guy by the name of Douglas Wilson about this, and so we'll get into some of those conversations right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Some court cases can be complex and convoluted. This isn't one of them. The Kentucky Supreme Court heard oral arguments for the case of Blaine Adamson. He is the print shop owner who declined to print shirts with a message promoting the Gay Pride Festival, but offered to connect the local group to another printer. Before you jump to the conclusion that his decision is merely another religious liberty versus LGBTQ issues, consider other shirts he declined to print or decided to print. For example, he declined to print a picture of Jesus on a bucket of chicken, even though it was requested by a local church. On the other hand, he has printed materials for a lesbian singer who has performed at a Pride festival. He has so far won at the trial court and court of appeals. I hope the judges at the Kentucky Supreme Court agree with the other judges in this case that artists have the right, even the responsibility, to use their artistic talents that are in keeping with their viewpoint. Someone else who understands the importance of this case is Kathy Trutvetter. She runs her own print shop in New Jersey. She's also a lesbian. Though she may agree with the LGBTQ message, she emphatically disagrees with forcing people to print a message against their conscience. She also believes we have the constitutional right to free speech. She doesn't want to be put in a position of having to print a message on her shirts that she does not like. I wish more people on either side of our cultural divide would think through the implications of forcing a person to create a message that violates their conscience. If government can force Blaine to violate his beliefs, it can force you to violate yours. It is bad enough when a government agency silences your speech. It's even worse when that government agency compels speech. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I just mentioned the latest issue of Christianity Today has this article by Dr. Louis Markos, The Rise of the Bible-Teaching, Plato-Loving Homeschool Elitist. And it really applies not only to those of you that are homeschoolers, but send your kids to Christian schools. And even if your kids are in the public school, just the real need for great books. I went to the public schools, but I remember in my senior year in high school, I was able to take a great books class, and certainly valuable experience for me then. And of course, in graduate school, studied many of those great classical works as well. But let's, if we can, for just a minute, Louis, talk about Dorothy Sayers. It was actually reading an essay by Dorothy Sayers that caused Douglas Wilson, who's been on the program with us before in the past, to really put together a program like this. And some of us that have been on various boards of classical Christian schools owe a debt of gratitude to Dorothy Sayers, Charlotte Mason, and a variety of others. So talk about that, because this is something that was passed on from the British to the Americans, in a sense, via C.S. Lewis. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's just such a great story. If your listeners don't know Dorothy Sayers, they should know her. She was a friend of C.S. Lewis, a great apologist. She wrote a book called The Mind of the Maker about the Trinity. She wrote a book called The Whimsical Christian, where she defends dogma and creed and whatnot. She translated Dante's Divine Comedy. She wrote detective fiction, a guy named Lord Peter Wimsey, and she even did a radio program about the life of Christ that aired on the BBC. Same time Lewis's broadcast talks that became Mere Christianity were on the news during World War II. She was doing a play about the life of Christ. Fascinating, fascinating woman. And she wrote an essay, it was a paper first, and then it was later published, about the ways of learning, and she tried the lost tools of learning, it was called. And she wanted to bring back an older kind of teaching called the trivium. Now, that's Latin for the three ways. And originally, it was meant for teaching Latin. But she sort of linked it together with the stages of development. Think of Piaget, people like that, how the child develops. And so she talked about taking them through three phases: the grammar phase, followed by the logic phase, followed by the rhetoric phase. And if you go to classical Christian schools today, they won't call them, whatever, lower school, middle school, high school. They'll call them grammar school. Well, we still use that, grammar school, but logic school, rhetoric. During grammar is when you're learning and memorizing. Kids are a sponge at that age, and they need to learn and to memorize. They teach them all sorts of jingles and songs. They're learning all the foundational things, all the important dates and whatnot. And, Kerby, it bothers me when people say rote memorization as if that's an evil. Well, it can be an evil, but done properly, kids from K to 5 love to memorize. It's one of the things they love to do. If you want them to learn a foreign language, you don't teach it to them in 6th grade. Teach it to them in 2nd grade. They can learn anything. So once you move to the grammar phase, then you move to the logic phase where you're putting together all these pieces. You're learning to make arguments. You're learning what's logical and what's illogical, what we call logical fallacies. You're putting it together. But then after that, you move into the rhetoric stage where you are actually able to articulate your position, to understand worldview as we talk about it today. And so it's a very smooth transition in terms of stages of learning, and it can be used for Latin, but it can be used for any subject. Well, she said this, but at the end she said, of course, I don't think anybody's really going to put this into practice. And yet, 30 years later, along comes one of my very favorite Christian men, Doug Wilson. And you know how things are with articles. They've got a word count, and we had to cut it out. But Doug had given me a beautiful quote that he emailed me, basically saying, Dorothy Sayers said this couldn't be done, but she didn't understand the tenacity of evangelical Christians. And he's like, well, let's go ahead and do it. And so he started what's called the Logo School. And the Logo School is in Moscow, Idaho.
Yes.
Idaho. Now, if your readers are under, 35, they're not going to understand the unbelievable irony that the center of sort of conservative Christianity was called Moscow. Unbelievable. Wonderful place. And what he did is he started that school, one of the first classical Christian schools, and it started to do well. It started to get good press. And so Doug went ahead and wrote his own book about the lost tools of learning, following Dorothy Sayers, and explaining how this is a good system and that we need this system not only for secular schools but for Christian schools, right? Because, again, a lot of Christian schools are not that different from secular schools. They just have chapel. He was trying to institute something that I think not only, revived the secular world, but revived a lot of sort of denominational Christian schools that were starting to pick up on this rigor. And it spread really quickly. Doug started something called the ACCS, the Association of Classical Christian Schools. And every year, I've spoken the last 4 or 5 years, I love getting together with them. They always call it repairing the ruins, which is a phrase from Milton. And we are trying to, in a sense, rebuild Western civilization. And I don't know, Kerby, if you've ever been out to Moscow, Idaho, but what Doug and the folks out there have done, they've not only revived education, they've revived a community. That is a beautiful community up there that supports one. It's not legalistic. It's one that's filled with joy and wonder and awe, and they reach out and they get attacked a lot. Doug, man, that guy gets attacked. The first time I met him, I was a little bit afraid because I'd heard all the attacks, and it's just not true. The man is very humble, very gracious, but he speaks his mind, just like on your radio program. We need to speak up. We're taking back the culture. But he is very gracious and very humble, and he no longer calls the shots, as people like to say. His organization runs on its own. There's another one called the Society for Classical Learning. There are some great presses, Canon Press, Classical Academic Press, Memoria Press. I mean, all of this has grown up, and you might know that it's finally moved into the public system, what are called classical charter schools.
Yes.
Now, charter schools are public. You can't be talking about Christ there, but these classical charter schools, and my daughter teaches at one in Dallas, in Louisville actually, probably close to you all, the founder schools, these are all run by Christians. It's what C.S. Lewis might call smuggled theology. They can't be talking Christianity, but they talk the great books and they teach virtue, the good, the true, and the beautiful. So this movement has just taken off, and it's not reached its peak yet. It is still growing and still developing. And of course, the homeschool, we can talk about that too. The homeschoolers, it's moved into all different varieties, and they're all working together. And it's exciting. It's kind of a new ecumenicalism that I find very, very hopeful.
Let me just mention, Lewis says he can stay a little bit longer, so I'm going to leave him over after the break because I suspect some of you may want to ask a question or make a comment. Maybe you have a classical Christian school in your community. Maybe you've been thinking about having your child or grandchild go to a school and wonder about that. If you'd like to join us, let's get those calls in now, 800-351-1212. We'll try to give you that opportunity after the break. But Dr. Markos, for just a minute, let's also, since you were talking about saving the classics, it reminded me of, and I was thrilled to see that you put it in your article, because Steve Miller, my producer, and I were talking the other day about how the Irish saved civilization, Thomas Cahill's book. And there is a sense in which people are unaware of the fact that some of the classics that we take for granted were recovered and actually saved because of some of these Irish Catholic monks. And I've only got about a minute or two, but share that story because it's an example of sort of what's happening now in the evangelical world.
It really is. It's a great, I love that book, Thomas Cahill, The Irish Saved Civilization. He showed that a lot of the pagan classics were saved by the least likely people. These monks living out in the middle of nowhere on the edge of civilization in Ireland, and yet they're the ones, of course, this is long before Gutenberg, handwritten copies preserving the pagan classics. And again, I really do think God has a sense of humor. It's almost like the Lord of the Rings, where the least likely person, first Bilbo and then Frodo, are there to have to save all of Middle-earth. But God does have a sense of humor, and he's lifting people up, and he's taking us to Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, right? I'm sure your listeners know the story. Paul is in Athens, Acts chapter 17. All the idols everywhere. It's hurting his spirit. And then he notices an altar to an unknown God. And then he goes up and he speaks to the intellectuals and he says, I see that in all way you are a very religious people, for you have altars to everything. You even have an altar to an unknown God. And then he speaks the words I believe the whole Greco-Roman world was waiting to hear. Now, therefore, what you have worshipped in ignorance, I will proclaim to you as known. And he goes on to tell them about the God who does not dwell in temples built by human hands, but out of one man he created every race of men. He set their times and their nations, though he is not far from any of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As your own pagan poets have said, we are his offspring. And here he is. Paul is quoting two pagan poets. Epimenides, in him we live and move and have our being. Aratus, we are his offspring. In the original poem, Kerby, the he is Zeus. Paul recognizes that God was using this sort of pagan prophet to point to a truth beyond them, a truth that they did not know, that was beyond them. And the place he spoke was called Areopagus, or in Latin, Mars Hill. And that's why the place I spoke in Kentucky is called Mars Hill.
Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we'll take some phone calls right after these important messages.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of view can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants his best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to those phone calls in just a minute. This particular article, The Rise of Bible-Teaching, Plato-Loving Homeschool Elitist, actually posted August 19th, but arrived just recently in my mailbox. So, again, it may actually have an August date or, of course, arrived for many of us in September. And as I mentioned, Doug Groteis endorsed it. I would endorse it as well. And just before we get back to that topic, let's take some phone calls. We'll go to Alaska first. KJNP. Eric, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, good morning, and I regret that I wasn't able to visit with you when you were up here recently, but you're always in our prayers, and I listen to you very regularly.
Well, I'll come up there again. It was fun to be with our friends in Alaska, and that's not the last trip I'll make up there. I'm looking forward to the next opportunity.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, we all have a body of works that we're all supposed to have read at one time. We never got around to it. And I've been making atonement for this in recent couple of years here. And I have this wonderful trilogy of books here. One of them is Euclid's Elements and the Principia by Isaac Newton and the work of Archimedes. Yes. And,
heavy reading, but very good reading. Yeah.
Euclidean geometry, I mean, everything that we do in science is based on Euclid, except in maybe if you get into some quantum mechanics or relativistic stuff. But it's amazing how it drives everything that we do in the scientific world. And it's still absolutely 100% relevant. And, the comments on the back of this book here says Euclid's fame rests preeminently on the elements, which he wrote in 13 books and which is said to have exercised an influence upon the human mind greater than any book except the Bible.
Well, let's see if we can talk about that, because, Lois, one of the things you said in your article here I thought was really good, and that is to realize that when we're talking about some of these individuals, I guess if I can quote you, you said, because they lack this special revelation of the Bible, neither Homer nor Virgil, Plato or Sophocles saw as clearly as Augustine, Aquinas, Dante, or Milton. But it's still, you have to recognize that whether you talk about, he's talking about Euclid, or whether you talk about Aristotle or Cicero, these virtues are still time-tested, and certainly they did not necessarily come from the Bible, but they underscore and reinforce the Bible, don't they?
They do, and the way it was often understood, and this is something that classical schools are bringing back, because don't be fooled when public schools say they teach values. Values, something very different than virtue. Values, multiculturalism, environmentalism, tolerance, inclusivism, egalitarianism. I'm not saying these things are bad, but they're not the center of virtue. They've always understood until the recent period that there were 7 virtues. And they divided them into the 4 classical virtues and the 3 theological virtues. The classical virtues are courage or fortitude, temperance, justice, and wisdom or prudence. And what they understood about these classical or cardinal virtues is that they were accessible to people through general revelation, the way God speaks to all people through nature, through our conscience, through our reason, through our desires. And people like Plato and Aristotle and Cicero, they, through special revelation, they were all made in God's image, they were able to move and achieve some of these virtues. But the 3 Christian or theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, 1 Corinthians 13, those deeper and greater virtues awaited the fuller revelation of Christ and the New Testament. So this concept of general versus special revelation is absolutely key to any kind of classical Christian education. And again, part of the problem, Kerby, when I was growing up, the word total depravity, that's supposed to mean that every part of our being was subjected to the fall. Our body, our soul, our reason, our imagination, all of us is fallen. But too often I feel, kind of in the middle of the century, 20th century, people thought total depravity meant utter depravity, as if we were so utterly depraved, our black was God's white, our white was God's black, as if we've almost effaced the image of God. But that's not what Calvin taught. That's not what Paul says in the first 2 chapters of Romans. We're still made in the image of God. We're fallen, depraved. We need the measure. We need grace. But it doesn't mean that we are utterly depraved and unable to understand anything. The pagans manifested virtue. Those virtues didn't save them, all right? Apart from grace, they're not saved. But those were real virtues because God has written that desire in our hearts. You know what Augustine says in the Confession, you made us for yourselves and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. So all of this is on that crux of general versus special revelation, classical. And let me say something quick because the question there is that after the trivium is this thing called the quadrivium, the four ways. And the quadrivium focuses on math and geometry, music, and astronomy. So there is this movement from letters to numbers. But just to be honest, Kerby, a lot of us don't fully know what to do with all the numbers. They're working. We know it's important. Most colleges that have a great books program like my own do include Euclid and all of that stuff, Newton, Ptolemy, all those things. But I got to admit that sometimes we still struggle the best way. But it is understood that the numbers are as important as the letters and are part of a classical education.
Excellent. Just before I run out of time, since you were talking about the universities, one of the things you mentioned in passing, but I thought we'd come back to this, and that is certainly I know that some of the parents and grandparents right now are thinking, do I want to spend the money to send my kids to a Christian school? Do I want to homeschool? But you said something in passing that you do address in this article, and that is there are a number of, first of all, Christian schools, and you mentioned Biola and Houston Baptist, and we can mention Dallas Baptist, and we can mention on and on. But there are also others that aren't necessarily Christian at all. Hillsdale, for example, I have friends that teach there, although even though they're Christian, isn't necessarily Christian. University of Dallas, which is more associated with maybe the Catholic background, but not necessarily evangelical. But the point is there are a lot of these schools that would reinforce these values. And the tragedy that I see, and you just mentioned it in passing, is we give these kids this great Christian education, and then we send them off to pagan U, and some of them survive, but a lot of them are found in the ditches, and they end up on the side of the road. And that's a tragedy because there could be an opportunity for them in the higher educational institutions to have those values reinforced and those virtues reinforced, right?
That is so true. I don't know what we're doing. Why are we playing it by their rules? Okay, we're the ones we Christians, we're the ones that invented the university out of the Middle Ages, and we are taking it back, but we need to take it back more. And we've got to understand, all the statistics are showing most people these days will change their career 2, 3, 4 times. Not just their job, but their whole career. So this idea of going to a school only to get a special training is becoming defunct. We need to go to college to train us how to think, how to reason, how to be flexible, how to understand things and think outside the box. We need a good liberal arts education, and then we can go anywhere with that. We are, again, we're all afraid about this vocational training, and I wish we had more vocational schools in this college, in this country, more vocational schools for people that want to do something very specific. But for most people, get a general education that's going to teach you how to think, that's going to teach you how to reason, that will give you critical and creative skills, that will help you rhetoric, that will help you to actually articulate what you believe, think on your own without having to be told. But all of these things are important, and they come out of a classical education that immerses us in what I like to call the great conversation that's been going on since Homer and Moses, and it's still going on today. And that's, again, there are a lot of great schools out there. We need to support them and get our students there learning and developing and growing strong and confident in what they believe and understanding that Christianity isn't just a emotional faith. It is a worldview that has something to say about every single thing in life. And it is coordinated, and it's coherent, and it's consistent. It is a worldview.
Let me just mention real quickly that we do have a link to some of the books that Dr. Louis Markos has written. It's kind of the Amazon spot. You can also go to hbu.edu, and we've had a number of professors, including the president of HBU, on the program, so I would certainly encourage you to check that out as well. And if you find yourself saying, okay, you've really kind of intrigued me, I'd like to read this entire article that appeared in Christianity Today. It was actually posted in August, but it just came out in the latest issue that I have in my hands, The Rise of the Bible-Teaching, Plato-Loving Homeschool Elitist. A wonderful piece that will take you about 9 pages to print out, and so some great resources that are available to you. And so, Louis Markos, I certainly have appreciated the work you're doing, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much. Love to come back.
We will take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some of the issues in the news. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about him, we have a link to the website. We also have some other information about him as well. You can find, of course, his books. And, of course, we've posted his article on homeschool elitists. I think you'll really enjoy the conversation. And check out that Christian school in your neighborhood. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just for a few minutes kind of get into a conversation that will even continue into the next hour. And that is, this week we'll have another one of these Democratic presidential debates that will be taking place. And one of the issues that I think is starting to surface is what is going to be and what will be the position of the various Democratic candidates towards religion. There was a time in American history not so long ago where you could just kind of ignore religion. religion. It could either be ignored by just talking about it in terms of civil religion. The joke that I always like to make is back in the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower, who was at that time the president, announced a National Day of Prayer, and then he went and played golf. So it didn't take that all that seriously, and nobody expected anybody to take it all that seriously until 1960. And if Nick Pitts will be here tomorrow and talk about his doctoral dissertation, it had to do with whether or not John Kennedy, who was Roman Catholic, would take seriously his religion and maybe even take orders from the Pope. And the way he dealt with that was pretty much to say, we really don't take it that seriously. It informs me, and it's a little bit of my foundation. But he went before the Baptist in Houston to actually make the case that even though religion is important, it won't influence my policy. And so everybody kind of set that aside. Richard Nixon, who later was president, he was a Quaker. Nobody thought that he was going to be anti-war because he was Quaker. And then all of a sudden, something happened in 1976 that really sort of changed everything. Jimmy Carter ran as a born-again Christian. Matter of fact, just the other day, Jimmy Carter became the oldest former president. He now has lived longer than George Herbert Walker Bush. So he's the oldest president, former president. He also, I guess you could say, is one of the oldest Sunday school teachers, because I just ran into somebody the other day that was going to drive to Georgia just to hear, to sit in Jimmy Carter's Sunday school class to hear him teach on that. So nevertheless, that's Jimmy Carter. Well, okay, Jimmy Carter. Then the question was, okay, what about Ronald Reagan? Well, you wouldn't think that he would be a fan of people that are religious. After all, they'd been divorced. He was from Hollywood, but, he was the darling of the so-called Christian right. And so religion began to be more and more important. And then it sort of faded a little bit. Yeah, Jimmy Carter started it. Bill Clinton kind of ended it because, he went to a Baptist church, but nobody thought he took it all that seriously. And so it kind of faded away. But it has really come back in a really remarkable way. And our friend Robert Knight, it's the second article we've posted here, says that Democrats can't figure out whether they want to use government to drive Christianity underground or to replace a biblical version of it with fake Christianity. And he says those aren't mutually exclusive goals. But the point he makes is that you have a number of these Democratic presidential contenders who I would predict Thursday night will invoke religion or the Bible in one way or another. The lead on that would be the South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, so-called Mayor Pete. But even in this list here that Robert Knight gives us, Joe Biden has made that kind of reference occasionally. Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren, sometimes Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, sometimes Senator Kamala Harris from California have made some of those statements as well. So on the one hand, you're having sort of this appeal to religion, but meanwhile, simultaneously, in San Francisco, the Democratic National Committee adopted a resolution just the other day hailing the religiously unaffiliated as the largest religious group within the Democratic Party, growing from about 19% in 2007 to 1 in 3 today. Those are their numbers, and I think they're probably close to accurate. And the resolution goes on to declare that morals, values, and patriotism are not unique to any particular religion, are not necessarily reliant on having a religious worldview at all. And so as a result, this is where Robert Knight has some fun with them, because the point he's making is really the ideas that you hold up, the various policies that you try to defend, and the way you try to defend them, if you're not aware of it, come from Judeo-Christian ideas. He says the Democratic National Committee might want to try to identify areas of the world not influenced by Christianity or by Judaism, so those that don't have a Judeo-Christian view, that nevertheless embrace the sanctity of human life, individual rights, free markets, self-government, or women's rights. He says they'll be looking for a long period of time. Now, the point he makes is that non-believers, people that call themselves atheist, agnostic, or no preference, they can be patriotic. One of the things I say to my atheist friends all the time is, they'll say, well, I can be good without God. And I will acknowledge that some of the nicest people I've met are atheists. So that's not the point. But even though they may have integrity, they may actually make a moral argument for what they do, they don't have a foundation upon it because these ideas about rights, about fairness, about what is right and wrong, those really come from the Bible. And you don't even have to go and look at the Bible to find that. Declaration of Independence, as Robert Knight points out, says that indeed God is the source of all justice, because it says, for example, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed, what? By their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can go to John Adams, second President of the United States, first Vice President, who wrote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Or another quote that you have here by Robert Knight, coming from George Washington in his famous farewell address, who said, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports." George Washington goes on to say, "And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion." And so Robert Knight spends some time really pointing that out. So the point is that we are starting to see right now kind of a split even in the Democrat Party. The DNC's resolution calls for a rational public policy based upon sound science, universal humanistic values. But as Robert Knight points out, even the idea of science itself was founded in large part because of a Christian worldview, and arose in Christian countries, he says, precisely because of a biblical view of an ordered universe with a discoverable design. And then points out the fact that, yes, we do see one of the fastest growing demographics in the younger generation. That would be Generation Y and Generation Z, often called the millennial generation, sometimes called the iGen generation, that those that are the so-called nuns, they will on a survey put atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. Those have risen rather dramatically, and as a result, that's something to pay attention to, and of course the Democratic Party is doing so. So it will be very interesting to see, especially Thursday night, how to thread that needle, how much God talk will be used, because even recently someone who supported Mayor Pete said, although I like him, I don't like kind of this presumption that God would do this or God would do that or God would believe this or God would feel this way about a particular policy. And so we're going to come back to that after the break. But it is kind of intriguing that on the one hand, you're having some using a lot more, if you will, God talk in some of their policy pronouncements, at the very same time when the Democratic National Committee is working really hard to reach out to the nuns and the religiously unaffiliated people as well. So something to think about and something we will discuss in the next hour. We'll also get into kind of a fact check. Where are we in the area of immigration? How much of the border wall has been built? Are some of the policies of the Trump administration working? And where do we go from here? So we've got a lot more to cover. And at any point, if you'd like to join the conversation, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. You can find some of the articles we're referring to today on the website, pointofview.net, and we'll be right back.
So when people first hear about MediShare, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become MediShare members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With MediShare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time just continuing that conversation for a few more minutes about just the uneasy alliance right now between the Democrat Party and religion. It is something the Republican party's had to deal with sometimes in the past as well, because there have been some that have been sort of libertarian, religiously unaffiliated. So they've said, well, I don't know. I certainly believe in a limited government, but I feel a little uneasy about some of these religious people there. But if you go to a lot of these different Republican conventions, it sometimes looks like a prayer meeting, because just a very high percentage of people who identify as evangelical Christians, and even sometimes conservative Catholics and others, end up in that particular party. So that's been kind of one issue in the past, but it's become a big issue right now in the Democrat Party, because, as I pointed out just a minute ago, and you may not have been with us last hour, the Democratic National Committee just the other day adopted a resolution hailing the religious unaffiliated as the largest religious group within the Democratic Party. First of all, I love that religious in quotes, because they're by religiously unaffiliated. You're talking about the so-called nuns. Those are the individuals, a very high percentage, for example, of millennials who identify themselves as atheist, agnostic, or no preference. And then they go on to say that the morals, values, and patriotism are not unique to any particular religion. I agree. And are not necessarily reliant on having a religious worldview at all. That's where I disagree. Because as Robert Knight in his piece, which we've posted here, points out, go anywhere else in the world where the Judeo-Christian worldview is in maybe on the excluded middle, or it's maybe on the periphery, or it's not even allowed, and then try to find some of these values like, and he mentions sanctity of life, individual rights, free markets, self-government, women's rights. He said, you'll be looking for a long time, because as I point out to my atheist friends, yes, you can be good without God. That's one of their favorite lines. I can be good without God. You know, I don't deny that. You probably are patriotic, probably have personal integrity. You probably are able to be a good neighbor to your friends and neighbors and things of that nature, but you don't really have a foundation upon which to make that case. And the Bible provides that foundation, which is one of the reasons the founders, whether I last hour quoted from George Washington or John Adams, we can quote from Benjamin Rush, we can quote from all sorts of individuals that understood only so well how important religion was and religious values were, and a Christian and a Judeo-Christian foundation were to our country. So this is why you're starting to see some individuals, and probably the principal example of this would be Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who is, of course, 37 years of age, making some pretty incredible kind of religious statements, in part maybe to see what he can do to co-opt other Christians or other religious people, or to maybe just stand out in a group that don't really talk about religion very much. So the third article we've posted here is entitled Playing God by Kevin Williamson. I kind of retitled it, just called Mayor Pete and Religion, because I didn't want to make it sound so negative. But he says that Mayor Pete has managed to make an impression on the impressionable by insisting that God must surely regard air pollution as, in the idiom of the time, messed up. Just love Yeah. God thinks that air pollution is messed up. Oh, boy, I love that line. But anyway, one of the things Kevin Williamson said is the sin of presumption apparently has been omitted from Mayor Pete's negligent Episcopalian Sunday school curriculum. And, of course, he's having some fun at his expense. But the point he's making is there are some really strong statements being made, not just by him, although he gets the primary focus in this particular piece, but as I pointed out just a minute ago in the piece that we have by Robert Knight, he also quotes from Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Cory Booker, Senator Kamala Harris, or former Vice President Joe Biden, who sometimes will make some of those religious statements as well, and then spend some time talking about an interview that Kirsten Powers does in USA Today. Now, Kirsten Powers claims to have become a Christian. I have no reason to disagree with that, but even if she's become a Christian, hasn't really spent a lot of time kind of thinking through the Christian worldview, and it probably would be good if she did do that, go to seminary for a while, go to a Bible college, kind of rethink some of the things that she held to in the past. But that hasn't kept her from using this to chide her fellow Christians about the fact that really Mayor Pete's view is closer to the Bible. And Jesus, she says, for example, never mentioned abortion. Of course, neither has the Constitution. We have on this particular comment by Kevin Williamson, while he did speak a great deal about looking out for the poor. So the implication is that you could be a Christian and be pro-abortion, but you better, if you're a Christian, support the poor. And he goes on to say that Kirsten Power writes that though Christianity has been planted in a cultural vacuum, and she writes as if this idea of feed my sheep is synonymous with voting for a party for the welfare state, no matter what other horrified business may be on their agenda. And the point that Kevin Williamson is pointing out is the Bible is not in a cultural vacuum. The Bible has been considered by very serious Christian men and women, theologians, pastors, for millennia. And so as a result, you can't just necessarily pick and choose. And as he points out, the New Testament may not say anything about abortion, but it also doesn't say anything about child pornography or cannibalism. But we're not expecting Christians to be morally indifferent about that. And I guess the point I'm making is that when you have these very simplistic statements being made, whether it be by a Republican or a Democrat, whether it be by a conservative or a liberal, that haven't spent the time kind of thinking through the issues, it doesn't bode well for the kind of public policies you may end up in the future. For example, one of the examples that Kevin Williamson uses is Mayor Pete worries about factory pollution and feeding the poor. But Kevin Williamson says he apparently is unable to do the elementary mental work of connecting the two. Rather than starving to death or dying of exposure, the poor in the developed world enjoy a relatively comfortable and secure standard of material life because of these factors and the pollution they produce. The high-yield modern agricultural techniques gave the poor, he said they gave poor old T.S. Eliot the willies, feed humanity, are the principal reason the only famines that the world has known in recent years have been man-made, created by politics. Factories don't only produce pollution, they don't only produce factories and tractors and life-saving machines, they produce both, which makes a real life more complicated than, as he said, the cheap moralism that impresses the intellectually stunted. And so he goes on to say that if we're going to be really careful, we have to come to these principles that we have in the Bible and then do the hard work of trying to figure out how they need to be applied. And that's, of course, what we've tried to do for many decades now here at Point of View. And I think, if nothing else, illustrates that if we just get another few of these sort of throwaway lines on Thursday night, they're not really going to inform us of the kind of policies we need in the 21st century. Let's take a break. We'll come back and get into the subject of immigration right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Some court cases can be complex and convoluted. This isn't one of them. The Kentucky Supreme Court heard oral arguments for the case of Blaine Adamson. He is the print shop owner who declined to print shirts with a message promoting the Gay Pride Festival, but offered to connect the local group to another printer. Before you jump to the conclusion that his decision is merely another religious liberty versus LGBTQ issues, consider other shirts he declined to print or decided to print. For example, he declined to print a picture of Jesus on a bucket of chicken, even though it was requested by a local church. On the other hand, he has printed materials for a lesbian singer who has performed at a Pride festival. He has so far won at the trial court and court of appeals. I hope the judges at the Kentucky Supreme Court agree with the other judges in this case that artists have the right, even the responsibility, to use their artistic talents that are in keeping with their viewpoint. Someone else who understands the importance of this case is Kathy Trutvetter. She runs her own print shop in New Jersey. She's also a lesbian. Though she may agree with the LGBTQ message, she emphatically disagrees with forcing people to print a message against their conscience. She also believes we have the constitutional right to free speech. She doesn't want to be put in a position of having to print a message on her shirts that she does not like. I wish more people on either side of our cultural divide would think through the implications of forcing a person to create a message that violates their conscience. If government can force Blaine to violate his beliefs, it can force you to violate yours. It is bad enough when a government agency silences your speech. It's even worse when that government agency compels speech. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, let's look at the subject of immigration and really want to do kind of some fact-checking here. And again, this is one of the other articles we've posted. I think it is our fourth article here. This one comes from Politico. I'd seen some other references to the fact that indeed the number of individuals at the border has begun to decline. And if you think about kind of one of the signature issues of President, or at that time candidate, Donald Trump, it was the issue of immigration and building the wall. So first of all, I want to talk about, have we been able to reduce the number of people crossing the border? And that seems to be the case. And the reason I posted this one from Politico is they're not necessarily Trump supporters. The next one I'm going to point is really even a fact check on whether or not we've really been able to build the wall, because that was, again, one of those signature issues of candidate Donald Trump. And as he runs for re-election, we'll see where that takes us. But this particular article, which on our website, and you can read it in its entirety by Ted Hessen, says that border arrests, a metric for illegal crossing, plummeted in August, according to the preliminary government figures obtained by Politico, down more than 60% since a peak in May. And border watchers say it's largely because of an agreement Trump struck with Mexico in June. Mexican authorities, backed by the newly formed National Guard, are now cracking down on migrants traversing Mexico's southern border with Guatemala, monitoring river crossings, stopping buses carrying migrants from Central America through Mexico, and at the same time, the United States is making tens of thousands of asylum seekers wait in Mexico while their applications are considered. Now, I'll be the first to admit that just because the number of arrests at the border are down, that's a helpful metric, not perfect. Because if you stop arresting people or you don't catch people, you don't really know. But it does seem to be so significant as to suggest that what before was an incredible flood at our border not so long ago, that compared to May, it is down by 60%. And the decline in border traffic, if sustained, according to Politico, could amount to a major victory for Trump as he heads into the 2020 election. Perhaps more important, the experimental measures taken by his administration could reshape immigration enforcement for years to come. And so a lot of this has to do with when we would allow individuals to come into this country, and more importantly, what happens in this country of Mexico, because the Mexico agreement is one that says we will actually stop people at our border between Guatemala and Mexico if they are going to actually seek asylum. The international law says you seek asylum in the first safe country. And so if you believe that you are in danger in Guatemala and you make it into Mexico, you would file for asylum there, even if you wanted to eventually get asylum in the United States. So keeping people there have kept them from flooding the border in the United States. Now you might say, okay, why is Mexico doing that? This article reminds us of that as well. It says the Mexico agreement follows threats from Trump to impose across-the-board escalating tariffs on Mexican goods that would likely have resulted in severe economic costs really on both sides of the border. When the agreement was announced, it was widely interpreted as an attempt to allow Trump to back down, but wouldn't likely have had as much impact, they say, on migration. So again, this is something that illustrates when those threats came of tariffs, there were those in Mexico who may not like the president, may not like the policy, but do not like the consequences of those tariffs to begin to do what they should have done in the first place. And that is, you're starting to see these arrests dropping precipitously, both in June and July, and now at some of the lowest levels so far in August. We'll see where they are in September in a couple of weeks. It also goes on to say the deal with Mexico focuses on two main areas. First of all, heightened enforcement by Mexican authorities and the expansion of Remain in Mexico, which formerly were known as the Migrant Protection Protocols. And a lot of this was something that might not have made it very far if it weren't for some of the decisions that were coming down from the Ninth Circuit Court, which I'll get to in just a minute. But just before we do so, let me just also mention that one of the individuals who was watching this quoted, this is Todd Bensman, who is with the Center for Immigration Studies. He said before you had the implementation of these policies, you had assembly lines of buses that would fill up down at the Guatemala-Mexico border at different places and then drive them in caravans. Those big buses are now being interdicted at roadblocks and emptied out and turned around. So what before was a mass of humanity that was coming to our borders, more than we could possibly have handled, and still there is just an incredible overload of the resources at the border. But compared to where we were, say, in May and where we are now in September, a remarkable change has taken place. Which brings me to my next point. How much of the wall has been built? Because you could say that candidate Donald Trump, first of all, said we're going to control our borders, and you could say that some of that has taken place. But remember the other campaign claim that we are going to build a wall and Mexico will pay for it. Well, that one hasn't worked out quite so well. As this particular article, which is a good fact check, reminds us, despite the chance and Trump's repeated assurances that a border wall is under construction, what's been achieved so far doesn't reflect his campaign promises. Before Trump became president, we had about 654 miles of barriers between U.S. and Mexico. As of today, that really hasn't increased. But again, let's be fair. To the date, the administration has replaced about 60 miles of dilapidated barriers. And if you look at some of those, it's nothing more than barbed wire or a fence that somebody could walk over or drive over. So this has been very significant in terms of 60 miles of replacing those dilapidated borders. But there are 4 good reasons in this article why the campaign pledge has not been fulfilled. Number 1, they say opposition from Democratic lawmakers who say the wall is ineffective and that appropriating funds for it is wasteful. Number 2, unsuccessful negotiation with Democratic lawmakers to get money for the wall in exchange for protections for the so-called dreamers. Number 3, some of the property along the border is privately owned, and as a result, you have a number of Texans who have been unwilling to give it up or give up that land for the wall. And then number 4, up until recently, some of the prototypes being proposed for the wall had not actually been confirmed. And so according to Customs and Border Protection, PolitiFact was told that the agency has received about $6 billion to build 334 miles of new border wall system. That includes these so-called steel bollard barriers. And of the 244 of those 334 miles, these would be new barriers in place of existing structures. And as I pointed out, about 60 miles of that has been replacement barriers, which has come from Homeland Security, and now some from the fencing that was provided through the Defense Department. And so this is something that has been talked about for some time. Let's give the president credit where credit is due. He's been able to at least get some funds moved from the Department of Homeland Security and Defense to replace existing barriers with more substantial barriers. But remember that the Secure Fence Act was actually implemented in 2006. That was under President George W. Bush, and then continued under President Barack Obama. And here we are 13 years later, now doing not much more than replacing existing fencing with a couple of new things going up along the way. So that's just a brief assessment of where we are on the issue of immigration. Let's open up the phones. Perhaps some of you have some comments about that campaign pledge to build a wall, about the campaign pledge to control our barriers. Do you feel good about what the president has done so far? Do you feel like there is much more that needs to be done? Do you think it's a wasteful exercise? We'd love to get your thoughts. 1-800-351-1212. When we come back, I'll talk a little bit about the consequences of leaving some people here illegally and the kind of things that happen when we don't deport some very dangerous people. We'll be back right after this.
It is a horrible scenario, but it happens. Dennis writes about his wife who was diagnosed with leukemia. She's now a 2-time survivor. They ran up over $1 million in medical bills. Thankfully, they're Medishare members, and Dennis says they're so thankful for that, how people came together to meet their needs. Medishare works, and it can save you a lot of money. The typical family saves $500 a month. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
Every day we face new challenges. At the time of Jonah, the Bible says in Nineveh, they couldn't tell their right hand from their left. But in America today, a bunch of people can't tell men from women. In fact, some say men can be women. Christians are called to proclaim God's truth in every area of life. But who has time to study every crazy new thing the world can think of? I'm glad you asked. Get the information you need every day with Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Sign up to receive them via email at pointofview.net/viewpoints or find them on the Point of View radio app. Viewpoints commentaries, making sense of the world around us. pointofview.net/viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just as a program note, let me just mention that tomorrow I'm going to have in studio after hours, it will be Dennis Prager. He can't be here during the live broadcast, so I'm going to tape an interview with Dennis Prager, and then we'll probably play that on Wednesday or Thursday. Depends on how that can fit together. So he will be with us in studio. While I'm talking about in studio, we have Katrina Pearson in studio with us. She's been with the Trump administration. Jim Dennison will be with us. He's also going to be in studio with us. Tommy Nelson's going to be with us as well, as we're going to talk about the GAP program. Francis Chan. It is quite a lineup this week of individuals. And of course, Friday is our weekend edition. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford, and we'll be looking to what happens Thursday night at the Democratic presidential convention that takes place, the various meeting of the 10 candidates in something that will be, again, one of those opportunities to hear what their comments and prescriptions are and who out of that 10 might end up challenging Donald Trump in the general election. So we've got a lot to cover in that regard. But just before we take some of your phone calls, let me just mention that these next two stories real quickly, if nothing else, underscore the need for you, first of all, to read widely, maybe even to listen to Point of View, because the point I'm making is that the mainstream media sometimes just simply does not cover stories very well. And the first of these, I will give full credit to Mike Gallagher, who's a talk show host, actually one of his researchers, who was pointing out something that I've been paying attention to kind of in a local way. It's a local story that has national implications, and you'll see that in just a minute, because we're talking about an individual that has been a serial killer in the Dallas area, and now turns out that he was here illegally. And it's one of those questions that you ask, if we, back to this issue of immigration, had deported him some time ago, all those individuals that he killed may still be alive. And it has to do with a bizarre set of circumstances that developed, for example, when Phyllis Payne's family thought that she, at 91 years of age, died of natural causes. They'd seen her, and she looked like she died in her sleep. But then an unexpected call from a police detective surfaced something else that caused them to realize that actually what was happening is that she was just one of many victims of this individual who would smother his victims with pillows and then make off with their jewelry or other valuables. Because the women were elderly and lived alone, their deaths weren't necessarily considered suspicious, and so they weren't initially investigated. Now that they've broken the story, they already have identified 12 women that he has killed. And if I can just read this piece from the Washington Post, officials began reevaluating the deaths of hundreds of elderly women in the DFW area, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area last year, suspecting that they may have overlooked a pattern of homicides. And it began, interestingly enough, when another 91-year-old woman was attacked and robbed in her apartment. This man forced his way in, told her to lie down on the bed, not to fight him. She obeyed his commands. He placed a pillow over her face to smother her. She lost consciousness, but in a remarkable set of circumstances, a woman that was a friend actually discovered her, called the paramedics, and revived her, and that's when they realized her jewelry box was gone. Well, they began to investigate. That is, the police began to investigate because they'd had some other situations as well. First of all, they were able to track his license plate to that. Then they went back to another case, which was about 2 years ago, of a 93-year-old woman who had been attacked and robbed. Again, knocked on the door, pretended to be a maintenance worker, then actually knocked her to the ground, picked up a pillow, tried to smother her. But nevertheless, she was not killed, and they, again, were able to figure out what was going on. And then, because they had investigated him, had his phone, and recognized that his cell phone had connected with a cell tower about a half a mile from this woman's apartment on the day of the attack, and then all the pieces began to come together. Now, the point I'm making is that this man, who knows how many he's killed? We know a dozen probably already have been filed, but, he may be in the pantheon, you will, of Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Richard Ramirez, whatever. But the point I'm making is, number one, the press doesn't do a real good job of giving you the whole story. You have to read almost to the end of this article before you come across this particular paragraph. A citizen of Kenya, he lived in the greater Dallas area for more than a decade and had a history of DWI, assault charges, according to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. In 2016, he also been charged with trespassing at a retirement community in Dallas, where one of his alleged victims reported. He was being held on $9 million bail, and because he's in the country, here's the word, illegally, federal immigration authorities have additionally placed a jail hold on him. You have to read almost the entire article before you get to the point that this individual, another one of these serial killers, was here illegally. And if this doesn't, I think, illustrate the point that I'm making, that sometimes in an effort to tell us the story, you don't even get the whole story till you read the end, and that's assuming you read to the end and it was reported. It's just a good illustration of why you need to maybe pay attention to what we're talking about here on Point of View, and also recognize that you may need to read more than one story. Another one I want to use real quickly before we take a break is simply this. There was this wonderful story that came out just the other day from our friends at Gatestone Institute. We've had them on before, and they point out that in the very same week as this horrible attack on the mosque in New Zealand, you remember that one? At that same period of time, there were 200 Christians who were killed in Nigeria. It shows some gruesome pictures there. And, of course, this was primarily through groups like Boko Haram and others. But it points out that at the very same time when we were focusing attention on this killing, this horrible killing that took place in the mosque in New Zealand, the press was hardly covering anything about this. And as one individual points out, there were no marches for the martyred Christians, no tolling of church bells ordered by governments, no T-shirts, no public outrage at all. So at the same time when the international focus was on the killing there in the mosque in New Zealand, there was an even more horrific killing that was taking place in Nigeria. And as this individual points out, virtually no coverage, and I'm being fair, probably no coverage at all in that regard. Then another illustration that was used here is while NASA satellites observed the Amazon fires and prompted the world leaders to pledge to protect the rainforest, but the burning, chopping, and murdering of Christians was not tracked by satellites, and their suffering was not seen in television and newspapers at the very same time. And, of course, some of these are horrific. Boko Haram, even if they allow women to survive, they cut off their ears, and I won't even go into all the gross things that are happening there as well. And so that's one of the reasons why in this particular article we see a very good quote from David Curry, who we've interviewed many times here before, the president of Open Doors, as we look at the fact that we have Christians right now as the most persecuted group in the world. And if it weren't for our friends at Voice of the Martyrs, Open Doors, Samaritan's Purse, and a few others, we wouldn't even know about some of these horrific acts that have taken place against persecuted Christians. And so this article just once again reminds us that we have to pay attention to some of the things that are just simply not covered in the news. And, of course, I used one to tie to the issue of immigration, the other tying to the issue of the persecution of Christians. And so if no other reason, then I hope that you will consider what you might do to support this ministry, as next week we're going to be doing our Truth Team Week. It's for us to cover some of the stories that simply never get covered in the mainstream press. We come back from the break. Just real quickly, I want to pick up a couple of other very short pieces that are very relevant to some of the conversation we've had here on Point of View. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Don't forget, we're going to be covering a lot of very important stories over the next couple of days. And, of course, the Thursday night presidential debate of 10 Democrat candidates. We'll try to cover that as much as we can on Friday with Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter in our weekend edition. If you'd like to find some of the articles I've just mentioned, they are available at our website, pointofview.net. And if you'd like to get my commentary today, it's about the print shop court case, which I'll talk about after we have a short break and come back with just a few more comments before the end of the program. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the advantages of doing a live program is that already the news has changed, something I just said a few minutes ago, and that is if you look at the article that we've posted, it is our fourth article there. There is a paragraph that says a San Francisco-based federal judge initially blocked the idea of remain in Mexico in terms of an order, but then the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals actually reversed that decision. Well, it turns out that they sent that back to the judge, in San Francisco, and the judge has reversed the reversal. So here we are, that today a federal judge, this just happened a few minutes ago in California, dealt a setback to the new Trump administration rule that sought to block almost all asylum applications at the border. The rule, which was unveiled, required most immigrants who want asylum to seek asylum in a third country. In other words, that would be, in this case, Mexico. And that was originally something that this U.S. federal district judge applied to nationwide. And then the Ninth Circuit Court narrowed it to just the border states within its jurisdiction, which, of course, would be California and Arizona, since obviously Texas and New Mexico are in a different jurisdiction. Well, the judge, this is a one individual, one federal judge, changed that and said it applies to the entire border. We'll see where that goes, but it's a good example where one judge who was not elected, who is taking it upon himself to challenge the Trump administration, reversed what the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals did, and also challenge what the president has done. And if there isn't a topic for Kelly, that's one of those on Friday. Kelly Shackelford's certainly going to talk about that. So actually, the article, the fourth article we've posted here from Politico, if you go to the second to last page, the statement that's made right there has just been overturned by a judge in San Francisco. So if nothing else, that's the advantage of doing live radio. We just talked about the decision, and that decision has been reversed. I suspect he'll be reversed again. I suspect if this case ever makes its way to the Supreme Court will reverse that decision. But there we are. Just another one of those setbacks the Trump administration has faced because of one judge. Oftentimes the judge is either in Hawaii or in California, usually San Francisco, but sometimes they've judge shops some other places there as well. Just before we run out of time, let me pick up a point that I made just the other day. You might remember that on the, I guess it was the Thursday program at 3 o'clock, I did a teaching on debt. And I might just mention we're still making available the articles that appear on debt that was in the May issue of our Outlook magazine. So it's still on the website if you'd like to get it. But just to illustrate one more issue of debt, today in the Wall Street Journal, a writer pointed out that we should stop taking away the driver's license from people that are in debt. She says that there are some good reasons to suspend licenses, such as driving infractions, but research suggests that nearly 40% of license suspensions stem from unrelated missteps, and that it remains common practice today for unpaid traffic tickets, court costs, child support, even minor drug offenses. And she points out that revoking the license of a person who can't pay off a fine or a loan just exacerbates the problem, because she says all sorts of professions, taxi drivers, cable installers, caregivers, construction workers, HVAC technicians, landscape crews, maintenance workers, and plumbers all require the ability to drive. And she points out that if a plumber loses his driver's license, so goes his job and his ability to make good on any money he owes. And what I think it illustrates is something I pointed out before. It's like those old, antiquated laws centuries ago, which had like debtors' prisons. And it always made no sense to me, even back then, that if a person is in debt and you throw him in debtor's prison, you just eliminate the possibility that person could ever pay back their debt. But the group perhaps hurt most by these policies are minorities. In the third to the last paragraph, she says this: license suspensions hit struggling minority communities particularly hard. In one low-income neighborhood in Milwaukee, she points out, 2 of 3 working-age African Americans do not have a license, according to the Employment Training Institute at the University of Wisconsin. She quotes another study that found that 95% of California zip codes where African Americans made up more than a fifth of the population had license suspension rates above the state average. So I'm just thinking that here's a good example of a policy that needs to change. We need some common sense. We need it in Washington, D.C., we need it in Sacramento, California. We need it in Austin, Texas. We need it in Albany, New York. It just doesn't make sense to suspend a license for an individual that is in debt when actually the license may be the way in which they actually could pay back that debt. And it just, if nothing else, is just illustrative of one other thing we talked about earlier last week on the whole subject of debt. And one of the reasons we did that was, number one, because we have a booklet on debt, and we, of course, also have the Outlook magazine. And as I pointed out, this time next week we'll have our Truth Team, and this is an opportunity for us to come to you and remind you that we are dependent upon your gifts to keep this program going. And for as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, you can receive the Outlook magazine. For a higher level, you can even receive some of those booklets that we make available. And, of course, the most recent one is on the subject of debt. So if you'd like to get the articles on debt in the Outlook magazine, simply go to the website pointofview.net. Just before we go, let me just mention my commentary today is on the print shop court case. This is one that went before the Kentucky Supreme Court last week. It has to do with Blaine Adamson, and he has been an individual that has been willing to print T-shirts for a variety of different groups, but every once in a while declines because he doesn't appreciate the message or maybe the graphics don't make sense to him. And if you think that this is just because he doesn't like people in the LGBTQ community, recognize in my commentary pointed out that he declined to print a picture of Jesus on a bucket of chicken, even though it was requested by a local church. On the other hand, he has printed materials for a lesbian singer. And so the issue is not that. The issue is freedom. And in the commentary, I point out that there is a woman by the name of Kathy Trutvetter, and she owns a print shop in New Jersey. She's a lesbian, by the way, and she would certainly support the LGBT community, but she also agrees with him and emphatically, she says, disagrees with forcing people to print a message against her conscience. She believes we have a constitutional right of free speech, and she doesn't want to be put in a position of having to print a message on her shirts that she would disagree with. And if you think about this, that makes a great deal of sense. If the government can force Blaine Adamson to violate his beliefs and print something he doesn't agree with, something he disagrees with, he can force you to violate yours. And so this is a case of really free speech, even not necessarily religious liberty, and it's really a position of artistic expression, and we shouldn't be forcing individuals to actually do something or express something they disagree with. As I end the commentary, I say it's bad enough when the government agency, whatever it might be, silences your speech. It's even worse when the government agency compels speech that you disagree with. So just another piece of material that is available on our website. And if you would like to find some of the articles or even my Viewpoints commentary, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve and Stephanie for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. Tomorrow is our Millennial Roundtable. We'll see you right here on Point of View.
So when people first hear about Medi-Share, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medi-Share members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medi-Share, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.